Okay. Hello and welcome again to another edition of Talks with Agassi, with my friend and teacher, Joseph Agassi, a man who needs no introduction, literally has no use for it. So today we have been talking in our recordings of different elements of psychology, modern psychology. And today I wanted to talk about trauma and PTSD, something very...
You have to see what PTSD is.
Yes, that was what I was going. So PTSD, as far as the DSM is concerned, the manual of mental...
Yes, go on.
It is one of the most complex definitions, maybe the most complicated definition in the entire DSM. It's a big struggle for them to have defined it. And I have the definition here, but it takes some, I was going to get to it eventually. It takes some time to get through. What do you conceptualize PTSD as?
Whatever people who have trauma report, on condition that, of course, you bring them to speak. It's not easy to express oneself in a post-trauma condition. Most people in post-trauma go home and lie in bed and wait for it to go, which is a mistake.
And this is the joke about Israel, is that half the country's men are walking around with diagnosed post-trauma, because you hear there's a lot of things you hear about people who for 30 years, they're kind of weird, and then somebody says, yeah, well, he's never been the same since the war. Or
it's not only not being the same, but that you have certain images haunt you.
Exactly. That is one. So the way that the psychiatrists of the American Psychiatric Association, they sort of built a ring around what counts as post-trauma and what doesn't. And one of the main criteria is what you say, being haunted. That's recurrence. It recurs through memories or dreams. And that's one of the hardest things to treat, is how do you treat something that happens when somebody sleeps? How do you treat nightmares?
True. Some of the syndromes, manifestations are very obvious. If you can't sleep and sleeping pills don't help, then you are in a post-trauma.
Yeah. So according to the DSM, that's only one of the things. So recurrence is criteria B. You have to have things recurring. Obviously, you have to be exposed to an actual event in which there was real or threatened injury, death, violence, and so on.
Well, this event prevents you from having peace of mind.
Yeah, because you are haunted by the idea that it is going to happen again, or maybe not even by the idea. The imagery just keeps coming back.
And bother.
What was that?
And bother you.
And bother you. Next, they have avoidance. So to qualify for a definition of PTSD, the person has to be avoidant. They're either avoiding talking about it, like you said, avoiding memories, or avoiding people, avoiding places, anything that is associated with it.
Yes, and the difficulty here is that it being personal, it's very hard to locate.
It's very hard to locate when it is being avoided, that there's actually a trauma.
Avoidance. What image, scenery, people, events are you avoiding? Because you don't know it.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. And that is, yeah, there can be many times where it's right under a person's nose and they're not able to say anything about it.
And I don't know what it is, and so on.
Yeah, yeah. And speaking of the mimicry you just said, you just exemplified, there is a criteria D, is negative alterations in cognition and mood. Basically,
this is a very important thing. You switch moods. When people throw into your face what you are trying to avoid, then you explode, as I did just a few seconds ago, and then you can go back to normal.
Yeah.
Sharp moves are very symptomatic.
Yeah, it's either sharp moves in the mood, or it is a change in cognition where there isn't, there isn't a cognitive injury, but suddenly a person with adequate thinking skills is unable to remember or to think logically about a certain aspect of themselves.
You have it in sitcoms, for example, when you have a wedding and all of a sudden one member of the party draws too much attention to himself.
And that means in the sitcom that they have an unresolved conflict?
That they have something that they don't control. Of course, the writers don't have to know much about psychology, but they present it as a dramatic episode.
Yeah.
The most obvious aspect is that people ask, what happened to him?
About a person with PTSD.
When they display the PTSD.
Yeah, yeah.
The very display puzzles bystanders.
Yeah, there is, yeah, it sometimes does. It is interesting because there are many ways to be altered. So you can be what they call like flat affect. You can be born like that, or you can have been conditioned into that.
That's right. And the difference is really difference in expectations.
Yeah.
If you are regularly crazy and people expect you to be crazy, it's very different from this syndrome where people expect you to be very agreeable, very plastic, and all of a sudden, this already Freud said, when reasonable people behave unreasonably, it's a neurosis.
Okay, what is, it's so funny, so many basic things in the terminology of psychology have never been covered in my PhD in psychology. So what is neurosis? Nobody ever discussed neurosis with me. It's amazing.
It's a very confused story. The story is this. People spoke of neurosis and psychosis, where neurosis is a disease of the nerve system and psychosis is a disease of the brain. And the slogan was no psychosis without neurosis, meaning that if something in the brain is wrong, there is also something in the network of your nerves that is wrong, because people assume the brain to be a manifestation of the body. This is a very famous view of the mind-body problem called epiphenomenalism, which is very popular, especially among physicians. And then the slogan, no psychosis without neurosis, meant if something is wrong in your brain, something is wrong in your nervous system that makes your brain go wrong. And then it changed its meaning with Freud, where neurosis was mild and psychosis was severe. In neurosis, you are ambulatory, you behave more or less normal, except in moments. And psychosis is when you are already so far gone that they have to institutionalize you, to force you into a mental home.
Yeah.
And of course, this is refuted by the fact that many are what's called ambulatory psychotics, that is, the psychotics who are not incarcerated. So there is a big mess on the terminology side.
That was very, very messy. One of the things that's messy is the brain is part of the nervous system. Neurons and nerve cells are exactly the same, except one is nerve cells are outside the brain and neurons are inside the brain, but it's the same type of cell. But what is the mind-body problem?
The mind-body problem is one that Descartes raised when he said, first of all, I'm sure I have a mind, but I'm not sure I have a body. So now I have to prove that I have a body. The proof didn't work. So for generations, actually for centuries, philosophers looked for proof that my body exists, which is of course crazy. I mean, if you need your body to be proved, then you are sick. And it was R.D. Laing who said, really very smart, he said, if Descartes appeared before a modern psychiatrist, he would be declared psychotic. Of course, he meant it in joke, not seriously, but it is a very perceptive assertion.
Yeah, well, that's what the philosophers and the Buddhists say, that is in terms of modern psychology, psychotic. The Buddhists think the same thing. They speak not of the mind-body problem, but the mind-body illusion.
Yes, the point is that the Buddhists don't have the idea of a substratum, of substance. When Descartes says, I think, therefore I exist, it means I exist as substance, because the fact that people have minds is something that nobody can deny. It's a repeatable phenomenon, and therefore science has to acknowledge it. It is a science never can question the existence of the mind. What people question is, for instance, the eternity of the soul. If the soul is a substance, then you can't die. And Descartes was convinced that you can't die.
Because if the soul is a substance, then it applies to the law of conservation of energy.
Of substance, there is no conservation of energy yet. Conservation of energy comes later. Substance is by definition something that does not interact with anything else. Russell claimed that all substance theories are inconsistent except possibly Spinoza, but even that is questionable. And of course, Einstein's famous equation means matter is no substance.
Can we start at Spinoza and then get to Einstein? What is Spinoza's theory?
That there is only one substance.
God?
God, nature, me, you can call it any names you like.
Okay.
But the core of Spinoza's theory is there is one substance.
Okay. And then Einstein's theory, energy equals mass times something.
Mass equals energy. That's the equation. The mc square is not important. It's energy equals mass.
Mm-hmm.
So mass is not substance, but concentration of potential. You see, energy means potential. It's the ability to work, by the way. That's the meaning of the word.
But you see, yeah, okay. The ability to work, the ability to...
Take the word Georg, you know the name George.
Mm-hmm.
Georg means farmer.
Okay.
Ge is earth and org is worker.
Okay.
George. So energy is ability to work. Mass is matter, which is supposed to be substance, but it's not, because it's only concentration of energy. This is how Einstein understood the equation when it came up. See, let me give you a bit of a history, if I may.
Please.
Studying electrodynamics, people saw that since the field, which is a space field with forces, exists, it has energy, and therefore it has mass. The equation E equals mc square belongs to electrodynamics. And all physicists had a serious problem, how to make electrodynamics look like mechanics. Mechanics was what is called Galileo invariant, that is to say, it followed Galileo's theory of inertia, and electrodynamics followed a different law of inertia. It's called Lorentz equation or whatever it is. And all the physicists of the time tried to translate electrodynamics into mechanics. Einstein said, let's do it the opposite, excuse me.
Sure.
Agassi.
So we're back.
So we're back.
Okay, this is good. We got to have a little break because I was having difficulty keeping up. So, so we were talking about how the problem was interpreting
With terminology.
how the problem was interpreting an electrodynamic universe in mechanical terms, and you're saying Einstein flipped it.
Around, yes. Instead of trying to bring electricity to follow mechanics, he forced mechanics to follow electricity.
Mm-hmm.
And that was nuclear weapons.
Okay. And
because mass in concentrated energy.
Yeah.
Of course, Einstein didn't think that the weapon will be created in his lifetime, but that's a matter of speed with which a theory is applied. The theory said matter is energy, concentrated.
Perhaps for all his great insight, Einstein didn't realize the true depth of human potential in that warfare department.
Yeah, but it's also a matter of luck, because the question about nuclear weapons was the size of the bomb. If the bomb were too small, it would be only of tactic import. And if it was too big, then it couldn't be used. For example, Heisenberg thought at a certain moment that a nuclear bomb should be enormous. He made a mistake, by the way. So he got the wrong quantity. The unfortunate thing is that the nuclear bomb, the matter of the nuclear bomb that explodes is very small. It's two half balls which brought together become a whole ball, which has what is known as critical mass, too much.
Why is that a problem?
No, on the contrary, it was fortunate that the quantity was big enough to manipulate and big enough or small enough to manipulate and big enough to cause damage militarily.
Fortunate or unfortunate, it's interesting to think of what the world would look like without an atom bomb.
Exactly so.
But in our break, I had time to Google neurosis as well, and which is how we somehow got to physics from neurosis. But yeah, we were talking about the neurosis. What did it say? The dictionary said a relatively mild illness not caused organically, involving symptoms of stress such as depression, anxiety, obsessive behavior, or hypochondria, but not loss of touch with reality. So
you made it as confused as possible. Yes.
It wasn't me, it was the internet.
Oh, yes, I meant that, yes.
But yeah, so it seems like, you know, neurons are nerve cells, and neurosis, basically nervousness, is what the essence of the word is some sort of manifestation of nervous reality. No?
Not only that, if you take the purest serious illness, it's called paranoia. Now, what is paranoia? Kraepelin said a paranoiac is one who has an idea fix. And that makes most dogmatists paranoiac, which is ridiculous. And the manual that you referred to tried very hard to present psychosis as something which is sick. And they constantly came up with the idea that people who are dogmatists are psychotics, which is not true. Now, it's interesting that psychotics are drawn to dogmatic societies where they can blend.
Mm-hmm.
The fact that they need blend shows that they are different. So
Yeah.
it's not the dogma that the paranoia suffers from.
So why would you say that paranoia is the purest form of mental illness and not delusion more broadly?
First of all, paranoia is a delusion. So
Of course.
you
But is all delusion paranoia?
That's the point. The question is which delusion is paranoia, and DSM struggled with this regularly and failed repeatedly. And Fried and I, who studied this and wrote a book on paranoia, came up with a solution. People who suffer from paranoia have idea fix, and they deny that they have idea fix.
What is idea fix? An idea that cannot be challenged in their mind?
That they refuse to accept the challenge for, yes. They block all challenges to that idea.
Okay.
If a paranoiac describes, for example, say robbing a bank, just to give you a very unusual thing, and then they describe how they escape, and suppose the escape car doesn't work, what would you do then? Oh, I can take a taxi, he'll say at once. The fact that he gives excuses and guards his idea fix is something that all dogmatists do, but the paranoiac does it not noticing that it's defensive and that it's unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Many people are defensive, which is always a weakness, but not a mental weakness. It's intellectual weakness to be defensive. And the defensiveness of people who feel that if they cannot defend the idea, then the world will come down in a total collapse, then you know they are sick.
It's always an interesting case that outside of a clinical session, it's always interesting when in a discussion, you find that you have to sacrifice discussion of ideas in order to protect the mental health of your co-discusser.
Exactly. I remember the first time in a public debate that a member of the audience challenged me, and I tried to answer his challenge, and I noticed that he was collapsing, and I stopped. I wouldn't have a collapse of a member of the audience on my hands.
That's good citizenship. Yeah, a lot of thoughts. It's hard to make to remember where we were going even. Not that it matters particularly. I guess I just wanted, so to wrap up, the one thing I didn't mention about to wrap up the definition of PTSD, the one thing I didn't mention is alterations in arousal and reactivity, the people becoming hypervigilant or having anger outbursts or becoming self-destructive or addictions.
And you don't know how you trigger the symptom. That's a very interesting fact. It takes an effort to find out what triggers. In Freud's neurosis, it's easy. There are cases when you mention water and the person has at once a reaction. That's an example of Freud. Or when you hear a fire engine passing by, and you get tense, which, by the way, is very understandable. It doesn't have to be neurotic,
Yeah.
but it can be neurotic.
Yeah.
You know, get it every time you hear a siren.
Yeah. Of course, there's the thing that we've been kind of getting towards in this discussion is we have been. I think in the things that you were saying, you're looking at post-trauma in a way that is more flexible than how the DSM looks at it, because just a few of the things we mentioned are good enough for you and good enough for me to call a person traumatic.
Yes, because we are concerned with the patient and the manual is concerned with definitions.
I think the manual is concerned with, with definitions. The manual is concerned with the practitioners and with the school more than it is with the organization.
The manual is supposed to help practitioners, but it's too tidy for that.
I think it's supposed to help the pharmaceutical industry and the lawmakers more than, and the institutions more than the practitioners themselves.
Of course, this has to do with not rules, with the question of when can one plead insanity.
What did you label? What was the name you gave that question?
Norton.
Miloton?
Nothing rules.
Okay.
These are the rules that allow one to plead insanity.
Okay.
You can say, yes, I did kill my wife, but it was not me.
Yeah, I guess there's to go back to the PTSD, whether you say you have PTSD or not in a legal context, or means whether you can get some medication or some treatment. And I find, or whether you're allowed some, I forget how we say the word in English, some reimbursement, you're allowed damages.
Yes.
Which is maybe why it's so closely guarded. And the definition, which is a problem, but another problem, I think, in society today is then everybody is traumatic. Nobody knows about these definitions of trauma, and the discussion of trauma has proliferated so much that everyone is carrying around traumas.
There's no doubt that we all are victims of one trauma or another.
Yeah.
We are expected to take most of our traumas in our stride.
Yeah.
And when we can't, then we have the problem in hand.
That is the right. That's the problem with having a self-concept and a continuing narrative.
That's correct.
Because the gazelle in the National Geographic video, after escaping the claws of the cheetah or whatever, 30 seconds later, it's okay. It shakes off and then it runs away.
That's right.
It was another aspect of trauma that's interesting to me is the idea of generational trauma. And even more than that, the almost sci-fi notion of trauma locked in DNA.
Yeah, I think this is fantasy.
You think so?
We don't know much about how DNA works. In some cases, for example, in sickle cell anemia, they found out what defect in the DNA causes it. But otherwise, we don't. In some cases of cancer, they suspect some connection between the DNA and the cancer. But these things are not yet sufficiently clearly fixed.
Yeah, but so let me take a personal example. So we know about, or at least we have the theory of epigenetics, that some genes are expressed or suppressed because of certain environment. More stress or hunger or whatever may make some genes come out.
So let me tell you, in Science magazine, there was an article, as long as the magazine allows, about the question, is paranoia hereditary?
Mm-hmm.
Now, clearly, to have paranoia, you need some shakeup. So it's not the paranoia, but being disposed to be paranoid that is perhaps genetic. So it's not the paranoia, but the paranoid personality, somebody who may become paranoid if and only if, and so on. So the question is, how do you find out? So there was a study of that, and they used questionnaires to look at the conditions that all people who suffer paranoia share. Now, they tried to show that paranoia was inborn. And one of the questions in the questionnaire was, do you have members of your family that are paranoiac? And I said, this makes the whole questionnaire useless because the answer is a priori given that yes.
There was, the psychologists keep doing this. They had, in the 80s, research psychology was grabbing onto sensation seeking and thrill seeking as a predictor of addictive behaviors. And they showed that the questionnaire,
They showed that everybody is.
Oh, no, well, sure, but the questionnaires showed that the greater correlation, the greater score of sensation seeking was correlated with greater addictive behavior. And then one of the questions in sensation seeking was, do you use drugs? Do you have alcohol problems?
And so on and so on. Yes, it is clear that these things, people have to test their questionnaires before using them. And this they do seldom.
Yeah, people don't only have to test their questionnaires, but people should have a mind of their questionnaire and what good is it supposed to shine on the world, rather than is it going to pass the statistically significant effect to show a correlation so it can get published. But
exactly, there is this difference that when usually you discuss diagnostics, you are discussing sufferings of existing people around you. And when you do the statistics, you don't assume that. You want to differentiate between the sick and the non-sick. And these are very different attitudes, two extremely different, cannot be more different. One is that you have a sick person and you have to attend to him. And another is you have a population among whom there are some people that have certain quality and you want to find out who they are. They're completely different attitudes, and people confuse them regularly.
They do, and the second one you mentioned is the one that rules more,
yes.
Unfortunately.
Yes, especially when you find something sensational. Once they argued in America that there is no more working class, because in the questionnaire, instead of asking you, do you belong to the working class, they asked, do you belong to the lower class?
Wow. Okay.
One mistake, and it.
One thing I wanted to came to my mind to ask you just now, as in our discussions of trauma. So you have been alive in Israel, a very traumatic state, for a very long time, and I was wondering, because you have seen a lot of people go through war, various wars, and I was wondering if you have a reflection on when does someone pull out of it and when someone doesn't? How, if any patterns emerge to you in
only one item, and that is the idea that the sacrifices due to the Yom Kippur War were unjustified. They were consequences of neglect in the leadership. And that makes a great difference, because Israelis are willing to make sacrifices, but not in order to justify stupid neglect of the leadership. And that makes a great national trauma, the recognition of the neglect. So one has to show that trauma has a link to a sense of justice. Who says this? I want to know if anybody.
If anyone says that trauma has a link to a sense of justice.
That's what I just said.
Yeah, yeah, I was repeating it so as to process it.
Yeah, you are quite right to do that, yes.
I think that, so trauma has a lot to do with causality or a locus of control. And perhaps that is related somehow to a sense of justice, because
I think you're right. I think you're right.
if we compare the 6-day war to the Yom Kippur, both very, very bloody wars.
Take the War of Independence, which was the bloodiest.
Yeah.
And we, in our stride, because we were proud of it and because it was imposed on us.
Yeah, so do you feel like the post-trauma from the War of Independence was less than from Yom Kippur because of the sense of justice?
Although the experience was harsher, it was different. And I have a case study. There were 35 people who were killed for no good reason in the war. It's well-known trauma, national trauma. The 35 who were killed, they were on the way to bring aid to a secluded unit, and they were killed on the way. And the death was unjustified, and so it's a trauma till today.
Israelis killed Israelis, you mean?
No, it's not known how they were killed. They were found dead, all of them.
Okay. I didn't know about this incident.
Not only that, they sent units to look for them, and one of the units was killed. He got, by the way, shot through his eyeglass, through his, what is it?
Binoculars.
Binoculars. Yeah. He was killed by a bullet that went through the binoculars to his brain.
Wow. Interesting. I'm still thinking about the concept of injustice as a factor in trauma, linking it back to today and this day and age, where many people in the common, just in the atmosphere of the internet, of self-discussion, self-exploration, so many people are discussing their own trauma. This is also a time in humanity where the discussion of injustice along racial, gender, and economic lines is increasing. So, yeah.
Yes.
And for me, there's always an interesting balance between acknowledging trauma and not avoiding it, to perseverating on it and actually making it more by dwelling on said injustices, or maybe
that's why in macho society a trauma is much worse.
In macho, you mean like in a patriarchal society, or
in a society of male dominance, which is not male dominance. I just use the standard label.
Yeah, in macho society, in a kind of more alpha society, there's more trauma.
No, the trauma is of worse consequences, because you're supposed to be a man and to overcome, and so on.
Yeah.
The unreasonable expectations always do a lot of damage. That's what I'm trying to say, that these things have much to do with expectations, and therefore with justice, of course, because justice is fitting the expectations.
So how do we solve it? How do we solve the trauma of the world? Redefine justice?
By reducing standards, always reducing standards. There is one traditional attitude, more amongst Christians than amongst Muslims or Jews, of always raising the standards in the hope of improving performance. And this is refuted empirically. If you make the expectations more reasonable, then you can get more compliance. And of course, especially the sexual standards until 1900 were intolerable.
Yeah, yes, for sure.
Impossible. You know, you masturbate and that proves that you are rubbish, that you are really not fit for human society. That everybody masturbates is another matter.
Right, yeah, it's so hard to make sense of anything. The levels of dishonesty and narrative in really any time is amazing. And as we talked earlier, we were talking about what is true mental illness, the degree of mild delusions that people are not are very protective of, you know, full blown, yes, it's psychotic, but mildly, yeah, it looks very much like dogma and a specific dogma, and that's kind of where we all are to some degree.
Yeah, and that's what I ascribed to Freud, saying that some dogmas are neurosis.
Okay, that beautifully brought us around full circle. So I think I will finish the recording here, and thank you very much for your time.
Welcome.